In this video, we'll explore the idea that the Sandman is, as Neil Gaiman describes it, a story about stories. We'll focus on Gaiman's belief that humans are essentially narrative beings and how stories play a crucial role in shaping our understanding of the world and our own identities. We will do this by analyzing the characters of Lyta Hall, Rose Walker, and Morpheus and how they are portrayed in Sandman. As we delve into the lives and experiences of those characters, we will see how their perceptions of themselves and others are influenced by their relationships, their surroundings, and the events they encounter. By analyzing their actions and motivations, we will gain a deeper understanding of who these characters are and how they fit into the larger narrative of Sandman. The Sandman series is ultimately about the power of stories and how they can be used to shape the world around us. Gaiman draws on a wide range of storytelling traditions and his own ideas about the nature of stories to develop the plot, setting, and characters in the series. Humans in Sandman perpetually try to understand the world around them and their relationship to it. Most of the central dynamics in the Sandman are not between humans and the world, but between humans and the ideas they use to justify their interaction with the world. It is both stated and implied in the Sandman that humans use stories to make sense of and interact with the world. We assign meanings to events, objects, and other people as a way of understanding and organizing our experiences. Gaiman is more interested in how people understand and perceive reality rather than what is objectively real. He focuses on the way humans create their own ideas and understandings and how they build on or interact with existing ones. The central premise is that the way we think and process information is similar to the way we tell stories. Both involve organizing and evaluating information, selecting what is important and discarding what is not. This process helps us make sense of a lot of information and creates a coherent system of beliefs or facts, just like how we arrange the events of a story into a clear plot. When we examine the characters in the Sandman, such as the supernatural Morpheus and the mortal Lyta Hall, we will see how they try to understand the world based on their pre-existing knowledge. More importantly, we will see that the stories they believe shape their actions, both big and small. The dynamic between the real and imaginary is reciprocal. Just as history can become myth or fiction, in the Sandman, myths and stories become reigning, powerful gods, and imaginary beings like Gilbert and the Corinthian can act with real consequences in the physical world. A common theme in the Sandman is a person, usually mortal character, encountering supernatural events that do not fit within their existing understanding of the world. This interaction can lead to enlightenment, denial, or confusion. In some cases, an inability to process the unusual occurrence can have tragic consequences. Characters' opinions do determine their options, with results that can be either tragic or triumphant. In many ways, the Sandman is a chronicle of people at the mercy of their opinions, perceptions, and subjectivity, their habitual ways of narrating, and the stories they tell themselves. Some are saved or damned because they do not fully understand their situation. Others must deal with having too much knowledge, or rather knowledge that does not fit with their pre-existing narratives or understandings. Encounters with alternate narratives are always powerful. On a personal level, wisdom can only come from transcending one's own limited perceptions, but for many of the characters in the Sandman, this is a twofold challenge. Not only must they overcome their own prejudices, but they live in a world in which perceptions have a life of their own. For instance, Fiddler's Green exists independently of the humans who envision it as a place, to the point that it can take on human form as Gilbert based on G.K. Chesterton. The Sandman is about how stories work and how they relate to our beliefs and ideologies. It suggests that the stories we tell are connected to the way we understand and interact with the world. The stories we tell can't help but reflect our beliefs, and at the same time, our beliefs are influenced by the stories we tell. The stories we create and the larger ideologies we hold serve as a bridge between our minds and the outside world, helping us make sense of information and experiences in a way that meets our psychological needs. Another great example of these are the three, the Fates, Kindly Ones, or Hecate, whichever name you prefer. We already saw how different characters see different versions of the Kindly Ones. Characters see the version that is most significant to them. John Dee asks the Fates to tell him his future, and they speak to him through the bodies of his victims. Rose Walker, on the other hand, sees the Fates in the same way as Morpheus did. And to keep it spoiler-free, other characters in the comic will perceive them differently, and the Fates will represent parts of their actual life. This is how Gaiman addresses that real-life experiences can become fictionalized. In the Sandman's exploration of moral questions, the power of the individual becomes significant. Gaiman emphasizes the agency of the individual who, knowingly or unknowingly, chooses their own values and decides whether to follow them. Gaiman's humans use narratives to interact with the external world. However, we will also see that they use them to interact with themselves. Just as they superimpose narratives over the world to make it understandable, they synthesize an identity in order to manage their own nebulous, multi-layered minds. This identity is a narrative, a default way of understanding information and deciding how to act. Many of the Sandman's characters are overtly synthetic beings. We actually watch Morpheus, so to speak, edit Corinthian when he proves unsatisfactory. Fiddler's Green takes advantage of its status as a synthetic, a legendary paradise to completely remodel its identity, turning itself into a human modeled on G.K. Chesterton. It is telling, however, that the Sandman draws little distinction between real human beings and beings who originate as symbols or in fictions. It is logical that synthetic beings should have synthetic identities, but it is also indicated in the Sandman that all identity is synthetic, even those identities which belong to real people. In fact, the designation real people itself becomes inaccurate and problematic. This is shown on the example of Gold. Gold is actually an invention of the show, a fusion of two other characters in the comics. Brute and Glob were part of Dream's palace guard and left during his absence. They sought to rule their own realm, building it from the dreams of Lyta, Jet, and Hector's ghost. Dream put a stop to their schemes and condemned them to darkness for thousands of years. Dream's struggle to change is a running theme in the comic that's emphasized earlier and more prominently in the show through Gold, a nightmare who works to bring joy to the abused Jet. She wants to become a dream, and the fact that Morpheus acknowledges that she's capable of change is an important step in his own personal journey and demonstrates that identity is changeable and can be modified over time. The Sandman casts identity as a narrative because it overtly portrays identities as constructions. Take for example the tenants sharing Hall's house in the Doll's House story arc. In a community which includes Gilbert or Fiddler's Green, the identity of the human residents are just as overtly shown to be constructions. Zelda and Chantal have co-authored their gothic identities, Hall has created the co-identity of Dolly, Ken and Barbie are putting up the cheery facade of a perfect marriage so cooperatively that they consistently finish each other's sentences. Later, caught in the vortex, they will encounter each other's very different subconscious selves and the facade will not survive it. According to the ideas presented in The Sandman, much of our mental and emotional states are not immediately accessible to our conscious selves. This makes it difficult to fully understand and define ourselves through stories. The characters in the series struggle to create an identity for themselves using pre-existing models. However, the process of creating an identity is a dialogue between our own minds and the external influences and narratives. Our minds are the driving force in this process, internalizing and personalizing the material they use to create an identity narrative. This also gives us the opportunity to take control of the way we narrate and define ourselves. It is reiterated throughout the series that identity is both optional and fluid, even for entities personifying absolutes. Later in the comic issues, one of Dream's siblings remarks, "I didn't know you could stop being a god." And Morpheus simply replies, "You can stop being anything." Let us first examine Lyta Hall's relationship with reality. Lyta's fraught and finally disastrous engagement with her own dreams demonstrates just how problematic that relationship can be and just how many factors conspire to complicate it. Lyta is caught between old and new ways of thinking. Unaware that her ideas are constructs, Lyta trusts them completely. However, her story also shows that they are constructs and therefore unstable and unsustainable. Her interaction with the dreaming is determined by her own unresolved issues. And all of this starts in the Netflix show as she speaks to her dead husband while sleeping on a plane. Lyta's relationship with her husband illustrates the nature of interpretive stories. Lyta's own desires, history, grief, and life goals all motivate her to commit to a life with her husband in the dreaming. When Lyta follows her personal desires, she feels a strong urge to keep going with it, which leads to serious consequences. Lyta's story illustrates a key theme in Gaiman's work, the importance of individuals taking control of their own beliefs and the dangers of allowing those beliefs to dictate their actions. Even when confronted with evidence that the notion of a stable marriage and life with her dead husband in the dreaming is a fallacy, Lyta continues to insist on the accuracy of her misguided perceptions. The recklessness of this false certainty is central to this story because Lyta's commitment to false ideas leads directly to Morpheus claiming that her child belongs to him, and let's just say presents a heap of trouble down the line to keep it vague and spoiler-free if you only follow the Netflix show. Her pursuit of her misguided beliefs has such climatic consequences, and Lyta's narrative strategy is one of the most prominent in The Sandman. Even as Lyta commits to her narrative, there are clear indications that these narratives themselves are unstable and subjective. In the course of the Sandman, we see Lyta step between three different meta-narratives. She's cast as the passive wife in the Dream Dome, returns to the real world and takes up the role of practical and dedicated single mother to her son Daniel, and final third meta-narrative is not introduced in the Doll's House arc, but will become apparent later in the series. Lyta's narrative is nothing less than a journey through a landscape of fiction until Lyta's own identity merges with the fictional world. Against Lyta's story, Gaiman contrasts a self-conscious character of Rose Walker. These two characters are contrasted to one another and both pose major threats to the dreaming. However, Rose is more aware of her surroundings and critical of the events happening around her. These parallel roles and different approaches to forming their own identities are visible in the Doll's House arc, or the second part of the first season of the Netflix show, but it is made even more abundantly clear in the Kindly Ones collection of the comics where their stories run in parallel. Gaiman emphasizes different aspects of Rose and Lyta's engagements with narrative and identity. Heedless of the way in which narratives work, Lyta is free to engage deeply and without reservation with the narratives themselves. We saw that Lyta treats her narratives as implicit, unquestionable truths, failing to acknowledge any evidence to the contrary. In contrast, Rose embarks on a more self-conscious, critical relationship with the process of creating her own story and identity, and this engagement is challenging in itself. After the main plot resolution in the Doll's House arc, and this was not shown in the Netflix adaptation, Rose Walker confronts a crisis and struggles to revalidate her mundane life after she encounters supernatural events that she cannot understand or fit into her existing understanding of the world. Rose becomes the Vortex, a supernatural and potentially destructive phenomenon. Through her experiences, she encounters Morpheus, learns that her friend Gilbert is actually Phileas Green in disguise, and witnesses her grandmother Unity die in the physical world but continues to exist in the dreaming. These events suggest to Rose that her previous understanding of the universe and her place in it was incomplete or mistaken. If it was true my dream, then nothing makes any sense. Everything we know, everything we think we know is a lie. We just kid ourselves that we're in control while a paper's thickness away are things that would drive us mad, she says. These experiences can be overwhelming and disorienting, and it is common for the characters to struggle to make sense of them and find a way to cope. The process of seeking understanding and overcoming the limitations of one's knowledge is depicted as a normal part of life in the story. It is a common theme in literature and life, especially in fantasy, that people are constantly confronted with new experiences and information that challenge their understanding of the world and must work to adapt and make sense of them. Rose has come to understand that narratives, or what we know, are subjective and limited. She also realizes that narratives, or the stories we tell ourselves about the world, can provide a false sense of certainty and control. Despite this understanding, Rose finds it difficult to deal with the chaos and unpredictability that lies beyond the boundaries of her own narrative. These realizations represent a crisis for Rose as they call into question her previous views. When we meet Rose later in the series, she's still wrestling with the insufficiencies of narratives, and we see her making a list of things they don't teach you at school, echoing the feeling she has at the end of the Doll's House that the model she's been giving is insufficient to address the problems facing her. It is important to note that Rose never manages to escape the need for narration. Rather, she involves herself more consciously and critically in the creation of her narrative. In The Sandman, narration is an unavoidable part of human thinking. Rose has the ability as a vortex to merge the dreams of others and also to remove the boundaries between their conscious and subconscious minds while they are dreaming. This causes a disruption in the relationship between their conscious lives and subconscious dreams and has consequences for the people whose dreams are affected. The cheery facade that Ken and Barbie put up does not survive their encounter with their very different subconscious selves. For example, after their dreams are merged, Ken starts to act more selfish and shallow, and Barbie loses touch with her fairy tale dream world. The vortex has the power to cause destruction, but it is not always depicted as a negative force. In this situation, Rose uses the vortex to break down the artificial and unhealthy codependence between Ken and Barbie. As a result, they both change and their behaviors become more dysfunctional. However, this change also marks the beginning of a personal journey for Barbie towards a more authentic self and greater understanding later in the series. Through her experience as the vortex, Rose has come to understand the synthetic nature and limitations of narratives and now critically examines her own narrative. Rose understands the difference between the real world and the stories we tell to make sense of it. She knows that these stories or narratives help us to understand and navigate the world by establishing rules and expectations. However, this also means that we may not always critically examine our own beliefs and behaviors. At the beginning of the Doll's House, Rose is confident and carefree in her understanding of the world. However, as she goes through the events of the Doll's House story arc, this confidence is undermined and she becomes more serious and introspective. Later in the series, Rose is more serious, suffers more angst, and is constantly analytical. Gaiman is critical of those who blindly accept and hold onto their narratives without questioning them, as this can lead to harmful behavior. The contrast between Lyta and Rose is also evident in Lyta valuing certainty above all else and her being willing to make sacrifices in order to maintain a stable and unchallenged narrative. For example, she represses her own feelings and desires in order to fit into the role of a wife in the Dream Dome, even though this role is not authentic and her husband's behavior is foolish. Lyta's emphasis on certainty comes at the expense of her own happiness and authenticity. This is shown more prominently in the comics. Rose is looking for certainty, but she's also more careful and critical about the process of finding it. Essentially, Lyta does not see the difference between her perceptions and objective reality, so she fights to conform to and reacts in terms of what she perceives. Rose believes that the world is objective, but also that it is more complicated than she understands. Carefully and critically, she's looking for a way to understand it. She has to, not only because she knows the narratives are fallible, but because she accepts responsibility for her thoughts and behavior. This personal responsibility is important to Rose. To her, the most chilling possibility and the end of the doll's house is that we're just dolls manipulated by things which would drive us mad if we thought about them for too long. Rose values her integrity as an individual. By accepting responsibility for her own narrative and not giving it up, Rose is taking control of her own story and refusing to let others dictate it for her. This shows a commitment to agency and autonomy. Rose's situation may be difficult and painful, but in a world of unreliable narratives and personal responsibility, it is necessary. When we examine Rose and Lyta's different approaches and the way in which their approaches let them interact with the world, Rose does seem to be at an advantage. Lyta is stuck perpetuating patterns that are familiar to her. She insistently defines herself through her relationship with others. This will lead to her unresolved issues culminating later in the series. In comparison, Rose's approach is far more fluid. Her distinguishing characteristic is the way she can deal with sudden challenges, unfamiliar situations, and people whose opinions and worldviews differ from her own. This is demonstrated in Rose's interpersonal relationships. Not only does she deal with the challenges that result from her relationship with Jet and Unity, suddenly becoming the vortex with potentially fatal consequences, she also has the ability to interact with a wide variety of people. This is demonstrated by her time in Hall's house. Not only can Rose interact with a variety of people, but she can also help them and be helped by them. Gilbert rescues her from an attack from a street gang, and the entire house waits to support her in finding Jet. Lyta has the strength of certainty even when she is catastrophically misguided. Rose's heroism lies in her ability to help those who differ from herself. By being open to outside influences and new perspectives, we can avoid acting in self-destructive ways and instead adapt and change our course based on new information. In this way, openness to outside influences can be a valuable resource. Rose is an example of someone who is able to do this and benefit from it. The Sandman saga advocates personal responsibility for one's beliefs and behaviors, and Rose exemplifies this by actively examining and trying to understand her own narrative. While this may be more difficult than simply going along with familiar patterns, it also allows her to be more adaptable and open to new experiences and perspectives. This makes her better equipped to handle an unpredictable world and interact with others. Even though Rose may not find a stable or conclusive narrative, her willingness to consider new information and have moments of insight makes her more receptive to growth and change. In contrast, Lyta's reflexive and less self-aware approach causes her to behave in damaging ways and limits her ability to interact with the world in a meaningful way. The idea of personal responsibility is central to Sandman, and when discussing identity and self-opposed narrative, it is important to consider the main character of the series. To fully understand Morpheus and his character, we need to look at his portrayal throughout the series, not just the Doll's House story arc. Despite this, we can still make some conclusions about the character's identity and narrative based on his behavior in the first season of the Netflix show. Morpheus' story is the main narrative thread of the series, and ties together the themes we have explored already. As the mythic personification of story, Morpheus is simultaneously narrator and narration. Morpheus must be reminded that his identity as an individual is just as inescapable. Morpheus begins unquestioningly committed to his ideas, but he will learn that there is more to this. His progress toward this realization will be an epic tale because Morpheus has dedicated himself so completely to his role as Dream Lord that he refuses to acknowledge his personal needs. Even in the personal life Morpheus allows himself, it is important to note that he prioritizes his narratives above himself. He may love Nada, but he reacts ruthlessly when he feels she has offended his dignity. This commitment to his narrative both limits and lessens him because it gives him no space to arrive at any decisions or observe any set of values that do not align with this single narrative to be the Dream Lord, to abide by rules and do what is right. Because he does not validate his personal feelings, he cannot let them direct or even temper his behavior. As an individual, Morpheus begins his story in a similar position to Lyta Hall, committed to a narrative which he treats as the ultimate truth, but which is only an incomplete and inaccurate representation of the real truth. However, while Lyta never recognizes this discrepancy, there are hints that Morpheus does, but refuses to acknowledge it. We see hints of this development in the first season of the show, but the character of Morpheus has not fully reached this realization yet. Before he takes responsibility for his narrative and reinvents himself and his ideas, Morpheus demonstrates how we voluntarily oppress ourselves in our commitment to our narratives. Even the most tailored narratives will never become the reality they represent, and like anyone using narratives in this way, Morpheus is interacting with his perception of the world, not the world itself. There are other characters like Lucifer and Rose who recognize their narratives as constructs and as arbitrary and take back the power they invest in them, making changes. For the individual in question, this is liberating and empowering, yet as Rose finds, while one can change one's narrative, one cannot escape the need for a narrative of some sort. Once one acknowledges the fallibility and inadequacy of narratives, one needs to constantly work to improve and adjust them. No story we tell ourselves is perfect. Gaiman can offer no better strategy than this torturous process of constant self-assessment. Establishing truth is a difficult, dynamic process rather than an objective assessment, and the validity of narratives is a continuum rather than a dichotomy. Gaiman illustrates how everything in the Sandman universe is affected by how humans perceive it and how they interpret and give meaning to reality through their own stories. To different characters, we can see how this changes the status of the individual and redefines their context within a community. However, acknowledging one's limitations opens up new possibilities and opens the mind to new insights and ideas. It also improves the individual's ability to relate to other individuals. The benefit of this struggle is that it forces us to improve our interactions with the outside world, particularly with other people. Failure to take responsibility for one's ideas and to evaluate their premises and consequences can be disastrous. This approach can be hard to follow because it requires dealing with uncertainty and recognizing that it is not possible to have a completely accurate understanding of the world. To be responsible, we must accept that there may always be uncertainty and continue to examine and reflect on ourselves. Ultimately, the Sandman is a meditation on how humans use narratives as bridges between the world and themselves. The idea that stories shape reality is a central theme in the Sandman, and this is evident not only in the Doll's House story arc, but also when considering the series as a whole. This theme adds depth and complexity to the series and helps to illustrate the power of storytelling in human life. It also serves as a reminder of the importance of the stories we tell ourselves and others, and how they shape our understanding of the world and our place within it. Thank you, The Waking World, for watching. If you enjoyed this video essay, please like the video to support it, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to be notified of the upcoming videos. This was Heads and Tails. Till next time.